We just submitted an impeachment motion, and during the first plenary session, precisely plenary session at 12:01 a.m. on December 5, we will be able to report it. Then we are obliged to vote on it after 24 hours and before 72 hours expires. That means we can vote on it starting from 12:02 a.m. on December 6. But we will discuss and decide whether to put it up for votes then or a little later.
For the first time since 1962, a no-confidence vote has brought down a government, ending Prime Minister Michel Barnier's fragile minority coalition after just 3 tumultuous months in power. The vote, which united lawmakers from Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally and the left-wing alliance, secured a decisive 331 votes, well above the 288 required, to oust Barnier on Wednesday night. President Emmanuel Macron now faces the gravest political crisis of his presidency as he prepares to address a divided nation. The collapse of Barnier's government, triggered by disputes over a controversial 2025 budget proposal, leaves Macron scrambling for solutions with limited options.
We would like to pay particular attention to the traced involvement of the main Directorate of Intelligence of Ukraine in organizing combat activities and providing weapons to the fighters operating in the northwest of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Nebenzia further accused GUR military instructors of training HTS fighters in Idlib for combat operations. Ukraine has yet to comment, but recently pointed fingers at both Russia and Iran for exacerbating the crisis in Syria.
We have repeatedly exposed, including in the UNSC chamber, that GUR military instructors were present in Idlib to train HTS fighters for combat operations.
It seems like every time I turn on the news, there's another political earthquake happening somewhere around the globe. From those sudden declarations to entire governments just crumbling, it's a lot to keep up with. But that's what we're here for. Today we're going to do a deep dive into 3 countries that are right in the thick of some pretty major challenges: South Korea, France, and Syria. Each situation is different, of course, but they all show just how quickly things can go from stable to shaky, and how much these events impact regular people like you and me.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and forget about that human side of things.
Exactly. So let's jump right in and start with South Korea. Honestly, I was floored when I read about President Yoon Suk Yeol declaring martial law, only for Parliament to step in and revoke it just hours later. It sounds like something out of a movie. What on earth could have prompted such a dramatic move?
Tensions have been simmering between Yoon and the opposition parties for a while now. There have been accusations thrown around about anti-state forces working against him. And that's created this whole atmosphere of suspicion and distrust. So declaring martial law, which basically hands control over to the military, well, that's a pretty extreme step in any situation, especially in a democratic country, which is probably why Parliament intervened so quickly to reverse it.
I can imagine that must have been a pretty wild time over there. Were there protests and things?
Absolutely. Protests were happening all over the country. There were even impeachment motions filed against the president. And the biggest labor union in South Korea threatened to launch nationwide strikes. It was just this whirlwind of activity.
Wow. So with all that going on, what happens next? What are some of the potential outcomes here?
Well, it's hard to say with certainty, but there are a few paths this could take. An impeachment trial is definitely a possibility. If that goes ahead, the Constitutional Court will have the final say on President Yoon's fate. He could also be forced to resign if the pressure gets too intense. But regardless of what happens, his credibility has definitely taken a hit. And this whole situation could have long-term effects on South Korea's economy, not to mention its standing on the world stage.
It really makes you think, how much power should any single leader have? And what kind of safety nets need to be in place to keep a democracy running smoothly?
Those are some really important questions. I think the situation in South Korea really highlights the importance of checks and balances in a democracy. It's a powerful reminder that power needs to be shared, and that institutions need to work the way they're supposed to prevent anyone from abusing their power.
Okay, so let's shift gears for a second and talk about France. I never thought I'd see the day when France would be facing a successful no-confidence vote. The last time that happened was way back in 1962. France has always seemed so stable, What happened to lead to this big shakeup?
It is surprising, that's for sure. It's the first time in over 6 decades that something like this has happened. It's a pretty big moment for French politics. I think to understand it, we need to look at the main players. We've got Prime Minister Michel Barnier, who was just appointed 3 months ago. President Emmanuel Macron. And then there's this interesting alliance that formed between the far-right National Rally, led by Marine Le Pen, and a coalition of left-wing parties. It's pretty unusual to see that kind of collaboration across the political spectrum.
So what was the catalyst for all of this? Was there a particular event that set off this no-confidence vote?
It all comes down to a budget proposal that Prime Minister Barnier put forward. It included some pretty controversial measures like tax hikes and spending cuts. And on top of that, he tried to push it through using Article 49.3 of the French Constitution, which lets the government bypass Parliament on certain bills. A lot of people saw that as pretty undemocratic.
I can imagine that didn't go over well.
It didn't. There was a lot of anger from both the left and the right. But in the end, it was Le Pen's National Rally that really tipped the scales. They withdrew their support, which led to the no-confidence vote, and ultimately the collapse of the government.
Wow, what a dramatic turn of events. What does this mean for President Macron and France going forward? It seems like this could have some pretty significant repercussions.
There's no question that Macron's position has been weakened. He's lost his prime minister. And now he's dealing with a parliament that's more fragmented and less supportive than ever. The far right has gained some momentum, and there's a real risk of prolonged instability now. France is often seen as this bedrock of stability in Europe, so this whole upheaval is raising some eyebrows about the state of European politics in general.
It's definitely a lot to think about. And that brings us to our third case study, Syria. This is a country that's been caught in a web of conflict and international power struggles for years. And now Russia is leveling some serious accusations against Ukraine, which just adds another layer of complexity to an already incredibly complex situation.
It's a truly heartbreaking situation, and this new development definitely doesn't help matters. Russia is accusing Ukraine of secretly training and arming fighters from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, which is a militant group that operates in northwestern Syria. To really grasp the gravity of this accusation, we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture.
All right, so let's break down the geopolitical landscape here. Who are the main players in this conflict and what are their interests? It's hard to keep track of all the different factions and alliances.
It is a bit of a tangled web, but let's try to simplify it. You've got Russia, who has been a steadfast ally of the Syrian government. Then you have the United States. They've been involved with the White Helmets, which is a humanitarian group that operates in rebel-held areas. And then there's this whole mix of other countries and militant groups, each with their own goals and motivations.
So how does this accusation against Ukraine fit into all of that? What is Russia hoping to gain by making these claims?
Essentially, Russia is trying to paint Ukraine as a destabilizing force. They're accusing them of supporting a terrorist organization. And this is particularly significant given the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine and the broader power struggle playing out between Russia and the West. By portraying Ukraine in this light, Russia is trying to damage their reputation on the international stage and maybe even justify their own actions in Syria.
It's tough to know who to believe sometimes. But the whole situation in Syria is just tragic. The conflict has dragged on for so long, and there doesn't seem to be any easy solution in sight.
It's true. It's a humanitarian catastrophe with far-reaching consequences. The human cost of this conflict is immense. It's a stark reminder of just how complicated international relations can be, and the devastating impact that prolonged conflict can have.
It can be hard to wrap your head around how all of this connects to our own lives, especially when we're so far removed from these conflicts geographically. But we can't forget that we live in an interconnected world. What happens in Syria or South Korea or France has ripple effects that can be felt globally.
Absolutely. These events have implications for global security, for trade, for humanitarian aid efforts, and they raise some fundamental questions about the stability of democratic institutions and the rise of populism and nationalism, which are trends we're seeing all over the world. These aren't isolated incidents. They're interconnected challenges that we need to pay attention to and try to understand. Absolutely, it's easy to get tunnel vision on the current crisis, but these events are often symptoms of bigger underlying issues, and understanding those issues is key to really navigating this complex world we live in.
That makes sense. So let's dig a little deeper into those factors that have been contributing to all this political turmoil. We talked about that whole martial law declaration in South Korea, but what were the underlying tensions that made such a drastic move even possible in the first place?
One key factor is this deep political polarization that's been growing in South Korea. You have a very vocal and active opposition that's been pretty critical of President Yoon's policies and his leadership style. This has created a climate of distrust and animosity between these different political factions, and it makes it really hard to find any common ground or tackle those pressing issues that are facing the country.
So it's not just about Yoon himself, it's about this broader societal divide that's playing out in the political arena.
Exactly. And this divide shows up in a lot of different ways. Those protests we talked about, which have been going on for months, that's a clear sign of this growing discontent. The impeachment motions are another example. That's a serious attempt to remove President Yoon from office, which really shows just how deep this political rift is. And then you have the threat of strikes from the labor unions, which could have a devastating impact on the economy.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It definitely has the potential to escalate, but it's important to remember that South Korea has a history of overcoming political crises. They transitioned from a dictatorship to a democracy, and they've weathered economic storms before, so there's reason to believe they can navigate this current turmoil as well.
Let's hope so. So turning our attention to France, that no confidence vote was a real shock. Were there any signs that things were heading in that direction, or did this crisis just come out of nowhere?
There are definitely some warning signs. One of the biggest red flags was the fragmented political landscape that emerged after the last election. No single party managed to secure a clear majority, which meant that Macron's government had to rely on alliances and compromises to get anything done. And as we saw with that budget proposal, those alliances can be pretty fragile.
It seems like Macron's leadership style might have also contributed to this crisis.
Yeah, that's a fair point. He's been criticized for being a bit detached and for bypassing Parliament too often. His decision to use that Article 49.3 to push through the budget, well, a lot of people saw that as a sign of weakness and arrogance. He miscalculated the level of opposition to that move and the potential fallout.
So in a way, he overplayed his hand, and now he's dealing with the consequences. What are his options at this point? How can he regain control and get France out of this mess?
He's in a tough spot for sure. One option is to try to form a new government, maybe with a different prime minister, someone who can rally support in parliament. But it's not clear if he can find the right person for the job, someone who can bridge that political divide. Another option is to call for new elections. But that's risky. There's no guarantee his party would do any better. And it could actually make the political situation even more unstable.
It sounds like he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. And this situation in France, with its deep divisions and the rise of the far right, it seems to mirror this broader trend we're seeing in a lot of parts of the world.
That's right. It's not just France. We're seeing a global surge of disillusionment with traditional political systems and the rise of populist movements on both the left and the right. People are frustrated with economic inequality, social injustice, and what they see as the failures of the political elite. This frustration is driving people to look for alternative solutions, and it's making them more willing to embrace extreme ideologies.
And this brings us back to Syria, where the complexities of the conflict are amplified by these global power struggles and the emergence of extremist groups. We talked about Russia's accusations against Ukraine, but how has the international community reacted to those accusations? Are they taking them seriously?
It's been a mixed bag. The United States has condemned Russia's actions, calling them a distraction from the real issues in Syria. They've reaffirmed their support for the White Helmets and for a political resolution to the conflict. But some countries have sided with Russia, while others have expressed concern about the escalating tensions.
It seems like there's a sense of fatigue when it comes to the Syrian conflict. It's been going on for so long, and the international community seems at a loss for how to effectively intervene.
That's true. It's a complex situation with no easy answers. And ultimately, it's the people of Syria who are suffering the most. They've endured years of war, displacement, and humanitarian crises. They're caught in the crossfire of a geopolitical power struggle that they have very little control over.
It's a sobering reminder that behind all the political maneuvering and the headlines are real people whose lives have been shattered by this conflict.
Absolutely. We can't forget their stories and their voices as we try to make sense of these complex events. We can't let the human cost of these conflicts be overshadowed by the political games of those in power.
So we've covered the political situations in South Korea, France, and Syria. Are there any common threads that connect these seemingly disparate events?
You know, despite their unique contexts, these situations actually share some striking similarities. They all highlight just how fragile political systems can be, the rise of populism and nationalism, and the growing distrust in traditional institutions.
So it's not just a coincidence that all these things are happening at the same time?
Not at all. There's a deeper shift happening in the global political landscape, and it's driven by this complex mix of factors. Economic inequality, the spread of misinformation and disinformation through social media, and this widespread loss of faith in the ability of governments to address people's concerns.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. And it's not exactly a rosy picture of the future. Where do we go from here? What can we do to navigate these turbulent times and create a world that's more stable and more just?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there are no simple answers. But I do believe there are things we can do. We can start by educating ourselves about what's happening in the world, go beyond the headlines and seek out in-depth analysis from trustworthy sources. Try to understand the historical context, the political dynamics, and the human impact of these events.
That's a great point. It's easy to get swept up in the 24-hour news cycle and lose sight of the bigger picture. But taking the time to really understand the complexities of these situations is so important.
Exactly. And once you're informed, you can start engaging with others, have respectful conversations with people who hold different views, challenge your own biases, and be open to learning from different perspectives.
And what about taking action? How can we turn our awareness into real change?
Well, there's so many ways to get involved, you know? You can support organizations that are working on the ground to address these issues, whether that's donating to humanitarian aid groups, advocating for policy changes, or even volunteering your time and skills. There are so many ways to contribute.
You mentioned supporting organizations. Can you give us some examples of groups that are doing good work in these areas?
Absolutely. The International Rescue Committee, for instance, they're providing essential humanitarian aid to people who have been displaced by conflict. Doctors Without Borders is another one. They're delivering medical care in some of the most dangerous and underserved parts of the world. And then you have groups like the Carter Center. They're working to promote peace and democracy through things like diplomacy and election monitoring.
Those are all great examples.
Yeah.
It's inspiring to see so many people dedicated to making a difference in the world.
It really is. And it's a reminder that we're not alone in this. There are so many individuals and organizations working tirelessly to address these challenges, and we can all play a part in supporting their efforts.
So we've talked about staying informed, engaging in dialogue, and taking action. Are there any other key ingredients to navigating these turbulent times?
I think one of the most important things is to cultivate hope. It's easy to get bogged down by all the negativity and just the sheer scale of the problems. But it's vital to hold on to that belief that a better future is possible.
That's so true. It's easy to lose sight of hope when we're constantly bombarded with news of conflict and instability. But without hope, we lose that motivation to work towards change.
Exactly. Hope isn't about ignoring the challenges. It's about believing in our collective ability to overcome them. It's about acknowledging the darkness, but still searching for that light.
I think that's a perfect thought to leave us with. As we wrap up this deep dive into global political turmoil, let's remember that we're not powerless. We have the ability to learn, to grow, to take action, and to inspire change.
That's beautifully put. As we navigate these complex and uncertain times, let's hold on to that sense of agency and possibility. Let's choose to be informed, engaged, and hopeful citizens, working together to create a world that's more just and peaceful.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Your insights have been so valuable. And to our listeners, we encourage you to stay curious, stay engaged, and keep exploring the world with open minds and compassionate hearts.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And that concludes this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into a different topic. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.